Hey guys, I'm T and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, we make trendy and fun crochet tutorials twice a week, and if you haven't already, smash that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to join in on the fun. For today's tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to make a modern vest. I've been into the idea of clashing textures lately, so I wanted to try my hand at a tri-texture top, and the results are even better than expected. A modern top with tons to look at, but not too busy. Speaking of, if you're not too busy to crochet, you are in the perfect spot to find your next project. We have hundreds of modern crochet tutorials and patterns dropping weekly, so consider clicking the bell to subscribe and you'll never miss an upload. Also, do me a huge favor and give this video a big thumbs up if you like it, or 2 thumbs down if you don't. Either way, it's a great way to show support so I can keep putting out free tutorials every Wednesday and Sunday. Now it's time to get on the show, so without further ado. For this project, any category 4 yarn will work, but I used a total of 200 grams of yarn, and that's 450 yards if you're stateside. As for tools, a 5.5mm hook, scissors, stitch markers, and a tape measure. Enter this week's pattern giveaway by telling us how many pillows you sleep with. I sleep with 2 pillows plus a penguin stuffed animal. Details for the giveaway down below. We're using 2 stitches for this project, and they'll be as follows: chain, slip stitch, and single crochet. This tutorial is made for a size small, but you can adjust it for your size, and we explain how to in the video, so let's get started. Getting this top started, we're all going to grab our category 4 yarn and make a slip knot. Then we're all going to grab our 5.5mm hook and start off by making an odd number chain that starts 1 inch underneath our underarm down to where we want the bottom of this top to be, so we can make this cropped or full length. I'd like for mine to be cropped, so I'm going to start by making a chain of 35, and that's roughly 9.5 inches or 24 centimeters. Now that we have our chain, we're going to do a single crochet row. So block off that last chain and do a chain 1. That chain 1 does not count as a stitch, that's our turning chain, and into that second chain from our hook, or into that chain that we blocked off, we're all going to insert, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through 2 for our first single crochet. Let's do this again. Into that next chain, pull through 2, and continue with 1 single crochet into every chain, leaving the last one. So we made our way all the way up with our single crochets, leaving that last chain. And into that last chain, all we're going to do is an increase of 2. So go ahead and insert your hook into that last chain with 2 single crochets. There's my first. Into that same last chain with my second. Now from here, before we move on to our row 2, what we're going to do is insert our stitch marker into any stitch that we'd like from the bottom, where we'd want our bottom detail to be. Now just to let you guys know my numbers, I've inserted my stitch marker into the 13th stitch from the bottom. That's roughly 3.5 inches or 9 centimeters. And this is just going to be for the bottom detail. Now this bottom detail isn't technically going to be a band. It's not going to cinch or anything, so you can make this as high or as low as you'd like. But once we've inserted our stitch marker into that stitch, we're now going to get started on our row 2. So from where we're at, let's all chain 1 and flip our work. So let's all get started on our row 2. Every even number row is going to start with an increase of 2 single crochets. So chain 1, flip our work, and into that first stitch we're going to insert with 2 single crochets. So there's 1, and then there's 2, all into that first stitch. And from here, we're going to put 1 single crochet into every stitch until our stitch marker is reached. So we are back, and we have made our way all the way down with our single crochets until we have reached our stitch marker. Now from here, we're all going to do our front post single crochets. So we're all going to start by finding that next single crochet by inserting our hook into the body of that stitch, not into the top. So I'm just going to take my stitch marker out for now because we don't need it just yet. And into the body of that single crochet, I'm going to bring my hook in through that gap, underneath the body of that next single crochet, and through the other side. We're not worked into that top stitch, and we're just going to single crochet per usual from here. So pull through 2. That is our first front post single crochet, and I am going to be inserting my stitch marker into the top of that stitch as well, just so I know where this detail portion starts. Then we're going to continue with 1 front post single crochet into the rest of our stitches. So finding the body of that next single crochet, bring your hook in through that gap, underneath the body of that stitch and through the other side, with a single crochet. Let's do this just a few more times. In through that next gap, underneath the body of that following single crochet through the other side with one single, and then once more into that next stitch, into that next gap underneath the body of that stitch and through the other side, pull through and pull through two, and continue with one front post single crochet until you reach the end of the row. Alright, so I've made my way all the way down with my front post single crochets. From my stitch marker over to my last stitch, I should have the same amount of stitches that I first inserted my stitch marker into. So for those of you that have my numbers, it was a total of 13 stitches. So I'm going to count from here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And just to end off this row, we're going to do one single crochet into the edge of that stitch. Now that isn't going to count as an actual stitch, that's just to close it off so that we don't have this jagged edge right here. So insert your hook into the last stitch with just one single crochet. Remember, that does not count as a stitch. And now our row 2 is complete. Now let's get started on the following row. So chain 1 and a flip. Now getting started on our odd number row, do our front post single crochets until we reach our stitch marker. So to get that started, we're all going to start by finding that second stitch from our previous row. So making sure that we're not inserting into that edge stitch, which is the single crochet that we did from our previous row. We're going to find the body of that second stitch, bring our hook underneath and through the other side. So that's per usual. Pull through two. Again, into that next gap, underneath the body, through the other side with another front post single. And let's do one more together. Into that gap, underneath the body, through the other side with another front post single. And continue with one front post single crochet until we reach our stitch marker. And as a really quick tip, we should have the same amount of front post singles as our previous row, or for the same amount of stitches that we inserted our stitch marker into. So for me, 13. Now I am back. I have my 13 front post single crochets. Now I'm going to insert my stitch marker into the top of that last front post single crochet, just so I know where that begins and ends. And then from here, one single crochet into every stitch, leaving the last one because we're going to increase together again. Alright, so we are back. We have one stitch left into the end of our row 3, and we're going to do another increase of 2 single crochets. So into that stitch, we're going to insert with 1, and then into that same stitch, insert with a second single crochet. Now from here, it's going to be a repeat of our 2 previous rows until we have an underarm portion that can reach from mid-underarm over to the front of our body, so roughly about mid-collarbone. And I just want to get the following row started with you, so let's all chain 1 and flip our work. So into that first stitch, insert with 1, with a second single crochet, and continue with 1 single crochet into every stitch until our stitch marker is reached again. We've made our way down to our stitch marker, and now we're going to do our front post single crochets again. So I'm going to take my stitch marker out for now, and then underneath the body of that following stitch, bring your hook in through that gap, underneath that stitch and through the other side with a front post single crochet. And remember to insert your stitch marker back into that first front post single. And to do the next one again, underneath that next gap, underneath the body, through the other side with a front post single. And continue with one front post single crochet until we reach the end of the row. We should have the same amount of front post singles as our previous row again. My front post singles are finished up. And don't forget, at the end of every even number row, we are going to be putting 1 single crochet into that last stitch just to make sure that the edge of our piece stays blunt. But that last single crochet is not going to count as a stitch. And from here, we're just going to chain 1, flip our work, and then repeat our 2 previous rows. Like I said, until we get an underarm portion that can reach from mid-underarm over to about mid-collarbone. And I'll meet you back right after in odd number rows so we can work straight into the shoulder portion from there. Alright, so we are back. My underarm portion is all finished, and I have a total of 7 rows. My width is just about 2 inches or 5 centimeters, and we all should have ended along the top. From here, we're all going to make an even number chain that reaches the top of our shoulder, making sure that our tail end still stays about 1 inch underneath our underarm. So I've already measured mine out. I need roughly 4 inches or 18 centimeters. So I made a chain of 16. Now we're going to get started on our moss stitch detail. So let's all block off that last chain. Then we're going to do a chain 2. That first chain is going to count as our turning chain. That second chain is going to count as a chain. That's going to make more sense in a second. Then we're going to single crochet into the 4th chain from our hook. So there's 1, There's 2. 3 is the chain that we blocked off, and then 4. So bring your hook down into that 4th chain and insert with a single crochet. And all together we should all have our first chain space and a single crochet. Now we should all have 1, 2 stitches starting off this row. Let's do this again. Chain 1. We are going to skip that following chain and then into the next 1 single crochet. Now we should all have 1 chain space, a single, a second chain space, and a single, or a total of 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches for this row so far. Let's do one more set. Chain 1, skip a stitch, single crochet into the next. And once more, we should all have a chain space, a single crochet, a second chain space, another single crochet, a third chain space, and a single crochet, or a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches for this row so far. And we're going to continue doing our moss stitch, so chain 1, skip a stitch, single crochet into the next until we don't have any more chains left to work into. So I've made my way down my chain with my moss stitches. Everyone's last single crochet should have been worked into our last chain that we made, and now from here we're going to do single crochets. So if you need to, twist your work so we're working into the top of the stitches from our previous row, and simply insert your hook into that first stitch with a single crochet. And if you'd like to, insert a stitch marker into your last moss stitch so that we know where the moss stitch starts and begins. And the rest of this is going to be per usual. 1 single crochet into every stitch until we reach our stitch marker. Once we reach our stitch marker, we're going to do our front post single crochets, making sure that the last stitch is a single crochet, but it doesn't actually count as a stitch. I'll meet you back at the end of this row. Alright, so we are back. Our first shoulder row is all finished up. We've made our way all the way down, making sure that we ended our row with our same front post single crochets. And now we're going to do our front post single crochets and 1 single crochet into every stitch until we reach our stitch marker. And then I'll meet you back so we can do our moss stitches together. Alright, so we are back. We have started off this row with our front post singles, did our single crochets into every stitch until we have reached our stitch marker. Now from here we're going to do our moss stitches. Now for every odd number row, once we reach our stitch marker stitch, and as you guys can see we are worked into the stitch that's right before our stitch marker stitch, we're going to chain 1, skip a stitch, which is that single crochet from our previous row, and then we're going to single crochet into the chain space from our previous row. So I'm going to take out my stitch marker for now. And like I said, I'm going to skip that first stitch into that next stitch, which is a chain space. I'm going to insert with a single crochet. Go ahead and insert your stitch marker into this chain space because that's the first stitch for this moss stitch detail. And from here we're going to chain 1, skip a stitch, which should be our single crochet from the previous row, and then into that next stitch, which is our chain space, insert with a single crochet again. And again, chain 1, skip a stitch, which is a single from our previous row, and into that next stitch, which is our chain space, insert your hook into that entire chain space with a single crochet, and we're going to continue this until we reach the end of the row. So we have just finished up our second shoulder row, and now it's just going to be a repeat of our 2 previous rows. So let me just give you some really quick tips when it comes to doing our moss stitches. Our moss stitch detail, counting from our stitch marker to the end, it should always be the same amount of stitches as chains that we made, so for me, 16. And we should always have the same amount of chain spaces as the previous row as well. So just to show you guys, counting from this first chain space that I have right here, for my first row, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Don't forget to count that chain space along the edge because it could easily collapse, therefore making it easy to skip over. And for this following row, I should have a total of 8 chain spaces here as well. So starting from this end, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then this stitch marker stitch is my 8th chain space. So my moss stitch detail is looking pretty good. So since this is just going to be a repeat of our 2 previous rows, I'm going to get started on the following row with you and let you do the rest on your own. So getting started on every even number row, we're going to chain 2. That first chain is going to count as our turning chain. That second chain is going to count as our chain and flip our work. And all we're going to do from here is skip that first stitch, which should be our single crochet from our previous row, and into that next stitch, which is our chain space, insert your hook into there, with a single crochet, and all together we should have our first chain space. It could be a little hard to see, but there's 1 and there's 2. So we have a total of 2 stitches so far for this row. Again, chain 1, skip a stitch into the next, single, chain 1, skip a stitch into the next, which is a chain space, and single. Continue this until we reach our stitch marker, remembering that we should have the same amount of total stitches as chains that we made. Then single crochet all the way down till we reach our next stitch marker, and then we're going to do our front post single crochets. So get this row finished, get started on the following row, so do your front post single crochets, and I'll meet you back just once more to do our moss stitches again. We've made our way up with the following row. We just want to get started on the moss stitches together again, and I have made my way to my stitch marker. All we're going to do is chain 1, insert your stitch marker into that chain that we just made, because that's the first stitch for our moss stitch. Skip that following single crochet and then into the next, which should be our chain space. Insert with a single crochet. So right now we should have 2 stitches for our moss stitch detail, which is our chain space and our single crochet. And that's it. Chain 1, skip a stitch into the next stitch, which should be a chain space. Insert with a single crochet. Now from here it's going to be a repeat of our 2 previous rows, and I'll meet you back once we have a portion that can reach from mid-underarm over to we're about 2 inches away from the base of our neck, and I'll meet you back right after an even number row or along the bottom. Alrighty, so we are back. My shoulder portion is all finished up. I have a total of 14 rows. My width is now 3.5 inches or 9 centimeters, and now we're going to get started on our neck scoop. So what we're all going to want to do is insert a stitch marker into any even numbered stitch from the top right at the base of our neck. And it should be all within the moss stitch detail. So I've inserted my stitch marker into the 12th stitch from the top, and that's roughly 3 inches or 8 centimeters from the top. And now from here we're going to do our following row. We should have all ended along the bottom. So we're all going to chain 1, flip our work, do our front post single crochets the same way that we've been doing them, and then do our single crochets, making our way all the way up. Now once we reach our moss stitch marker, we're going to do our moss stitches until we reach our neckline stitch marker. And then I will meet you back. Alright, so we are back. We have made our way all the way up until we have reached our neckline stitch marker stitch. And the last stitch we all should have done should have been a single crochet into the chain space that's right before our stitch marker stitch. So this row is basically the same way that we would have done all of the other rows. The only difference is that we didn't make our way all the way up to the edge. But from here, all we're going to do is basically repeat our shoulder rows, but the moss stitch detail is going to be a little bit shorter. And we're going to continue to repeat these 2 rows with no increases and no decreases until we make our way all the way over to the other side of the base of our neck, plus an additional 2 inches because that's where the edge of this shoulder portion ends. And we should all end along the top or right after an odd number row. So let's just get started on the following row, and then we can move on together. Since the last stitch that everyone should have done is a single crochet, we're all going to chain 2. That first chain is going to count as our turning chain, and that second chain is going to count as our chain, and flip our work. Now just like our previous shoulder rows, we're going to skip that first stitch, which is our single crochet from our previous row, and then into that next stitch, which should be our chain space, insert with a single crochet. Now just as a reference, we should have our first chain space, could be a little bit hard to see, but that's mine right there, and then our first single crochet. So we should all have a total of 2 stitches starting off this row. Then we're going to chain 1, skip a stitch, and into the next stitch, insert with a single crochet until we reach our moss stitch stitch marker stitch, which I am actually already there. Don't forget to insert your stitch marker into the edge of the moss stitch detail, and the rest of the row is going to be per usual. So 1 single crochet into every stitch until we reach our front post single crochet stitch marker, then do our front post single crochets to end the row. Like I said, we're going to be repeating these 2 previous rows until we get our neckline portion. I'll meet you back once we have this width all finished up. I am back and the width of my neckline is finished. I now have a total of 39 rows. My width is now 9.5 inches or 24 centimeters. And now from here, we're going to do our shoulder. So this shoulder portion is going to be done pretty much the same way as our first shoulder portion. Since we all should have ended along the top, what we're all going to do is make a chain for the same amount of stitches that we skipped. So for those of you that have my numbers, I skipped a total of 12 stitches. That's where I inserted my stitch marker. So over here, I made a chain 12. Then we're going to get started on our moss stitch detail. So let's get that started. We're all going to block off that last chain and do a chain 2. That first chain is our turning chain. Second chain is our chain. Then we're going to single crochet into the 4th chain from our hook. So here's 1, 2, 3, and then 4. into that fourth chain, insert with 1 single crochet. And now we should all have our first chain space and a single crochet. So far a total of 2 stitches for this row. Then we're going to do our moss stitch all the way down until we reach our moss stitch stitch marker. And that should all be within the same plane as our moss stitch detail. Then once we reach that, our single crochets all the way down, making sure that we close off our row with our front post single crochets. And then at the end of the row, chain 1, flip our work, do our front post single crochets all the way up, our single crochets till we reach our moss stitch stitch marker, and then our moss stitches all the way back up. So these rows are going to be done exactly the same way as our shoulder portion, so we should all have the same amount of stitches for both shoulder portions as well. We're going to continue to do this with no increases and no decreases until we have the same amount of rows as our first shoulder portion. And once we do, I'll meet you back, and we should all end along the bottom so we can finish up with our underarm portion. Alright, so we are back and our second shoulder portion is all finished up. I now have a total of 46 rows. My width is now 11.5 inches or 29 centimeters, and we're going to finish off our front panel with our underarm portion. So from where we're at, we all should have ended along the bottom. What we're going to do from here is our following row, which is going to be our front post single crochets with our single crochets, making our way all the way up until our 2 stitches right before our stitch marker. But just in case if you took your stitch marker out, go ahead and reinsert your stitch marker into the same amount of chains that we made that led all the way up to the top of our shoulder. So for me, that was a chain 16. I'll meet you back when we have 2 stitches left right before. So we made our way all the way up until we are 2 stitches right before our stitch marker. Now from here, we're going to do a decrease of 2 single crochets. So we're all going to start by inserting our hook into that second to last stitch, pull through, and then into that last stitch, which should be the stitch right before our stitch marker, pull through for 3 loops on our hook. Yarn over, pull through all 3, and then we're going to start our following row off with a decrease as well. So chain 1 and flip our work. And just to get started on this row, insert your hook into that first stitch, pull through into that next stitch, pull through all 3, then put 1 single crochet into every stitch until we reach our front post single crochet stitch marker, then finish off with our front post singles. From here, we're going to continue to repeat these 2 rows until we have the same amount of rows as our first underarm portion. And when we have the same amount of rows, do a chain up of 1 and cut, and then I will meet you back. Alright, so I am back. The entirety of my front panel is finished. I have a total of 53 rows, and my width is now 13.5 inches or 34 centimeters. I did do a chain up of 1 and cut right after my last row, and now we can get started on the back, but the back is actually going to be done exactly the same way as the front panel, just without the neck hole. I actually already have mine all finished up, so I'm just going to talk you guys through it. So getting started on the back panel, the underarm portion is going to be done exactly the same way as the front. So we're going to start off by making the same odd number chain. And we are going to maintain the front post single crochets along the bottom, making sure that they are the same amount of stitches so that it lines up once when it's all seamed up. And we're going to do the same amount of increased rows. Then we're going to make the same chain that led up to our shoulder, and then just continue on with basically our 2 shoulder rows, making our way all the way across for the same amount of rows as the last shoulder row that we have over here. And once we have that, we're going to finish off with the underarm portion that we just did together. And when we have the same amount of rows as the front panel, do a chain up of 1 and cut, and then I'll meet you back so we can seam it all together. So we are back. Both our front and back panel are all finished, now ready to seam our sides. So first things first, we're all going to place our front panel on top of our back panel. Then we're going to insert our hook into the bottom corner stitch of both the front and the back. Insert our yarn onto our hook, pull through, and do a chain up of 1 to secure. Then from here, we're just going to do a single crochet seam. So start by finding that first stitch into the front panel, insert your hook. Find that next stitch into the back panel, insert your hook, and single crochet them together. Just like that. Let's do this again. Find that next stitch into the front panel, insert, next stitch into the back panel, insert, and single crochet. And that's it. We're going to continue this until we don't have any more stitches left to work into. When we don't, do a chain up of 1 and cut, and then repeat everything we just did here on the other side. Alright, so we are back. We have just finished up seaming our sides, and now we're going to seam our shoulders. So we're first going to make sure that our work is still flipped wrong side out, meaning the seam that we did for the sides is still along the outside. And then we're all going to insert our hook into the top corner stitch of both the front and the back panel of our shoulders. Then we're going to insert our yarn onto our hook, pull through, and do a chain up of 1 to secure, and all we're going to do is 1 single crochet into every side row. So this is my first side row right here within the front panel. I'm going to insert into that top loop. I'm then going to find my next side row within the back panel, insert into there, and then single crochet. Let's do this again. This is my following side row within the front panel, insert into that top loop, my following side row within the back panel, insert into that top loop, and single crochet, and that's it. We're going to continue doing this until we don't have any more side rows left to work into. When we don't, do a chain up of 1 and cut. Alright, so we're back. Everything is all seamed up, and now we're ready to get started on our collar. So first things first, let's flip our work right side out, meaning all of our seams are along the inside, and then we're going to insert our hook into any one of our stitches. It really doesn't matter which one because it's going to come around full circle anyways. And what we're going to do is just single crochet into every stitch, and then put 1 single crochet into every side row. And we're just going to single crochet, making our way all the way around, and then slip stitch into that chain space. But a really quick tip before I let you guys go is that this single crochet row that we're about to do is going to be as wide as this neckline can stretch. So once when it's finished, try on your piece. If it's a little bit too tight, redo some stitches with a looser grip, or if it's a little too loose, redo some stitches with a tighter grip. But either way, I'll meet you back once the single crochet row is finished. Alright, so we are back. Our single crochet row for our neckline is all finished, and now we're ready to get started on the length of our collar. So from where we're at, we're all going to make a chain the length that we'd like for the collar to be. I'd like for mine to be roughly 1.5 inches or 3 centimeters, so I went ahead and made a chain 6. Once we have our chain, we're all going to block off that last chain and do a chain 1. That chain 1 doesn't count as a stitch, that's our turning chain. And then into that chain that we blocked off, we're going to insert with a slip stitch. So insert, and when we have both loops on our hook, yarn over and gently pull through both loops. There's one, and there's the second. Let's do this again. Into that next chain, insert your hook, yarn over and pull through both loops. Continue with 1 slip stitch into every chain, remembering not to tug too tightly after every stitch, otherwise the following row could be a little too tight to work into. Now that we've put 1 slip stitch into every chain, let's connect it into the base. So this is my next available stitch into the base. I'm just going to insert my hook in through there with a slip stitch, and now our row 1 is connected, and that slip stitch into the base does not count as a stitch. Let's do this again. Into that next stitch into the base, we're going to work our way up by slip stitching into there. That slip stitch also doesn't count as a stitch, and we're going to flip our work. And now all we're going to do is more slip stitches, now within the back loops. So find that first stitch from our previous row, not those slip stitches, into the base, and insert into that back loop, or the loop that's furthest away from you. Then yarn over and pull through everything. Again, into that next stitch's back loop, insert, pull through everything, and once more into that next stitch's back loop, insert and pull through everything. We're going to continue with 1 back loop slip stitch into every stitch. At the end of the row, we're all going to chain 1, flip our work, and put 1 back loop slip stitch into every stitch again, and I'll meet you back at the base. We've just made our way down, putting 1 back loop slip stitch into every stitch. We're now at the base again, so we're going to slip stitch into that next available stitch, just like how we did for our row 1. And now our row 3 is connected, remembering that slip stitch into the base doesn't actually count as a stitch. Then just to work our way up to the following row again, slip stitch into that next stitch into the base, flip our work, and then put 1 back loop slip stitch into every stitch. Then from here, it's going to be a repeat of our 2 previous rows with no increases and no decreases, making our way all the way around our neckline. When we don't have any more stitches left to work into, I'll meet you back so we can seam it all together. Alright, so we are back. We've made our way all the way around with our back loop slip stitch rows, and now we're going to seam it together. And this is going to be an outside loop slip stitch seam to make it look like another back loop slip stitch row, so let's make sure that our work is flipped right side out. Then we're going to insert our hook into the corner stitch of both the front and the back panel. Then we're going to yarn over and pull through everything on our hook. Now let's do our first few. Now let's all start by finding our first available stitch into the front panel and insert only into that front loop. We're going to find that next available stitch into the back panel and insert only into that back loop. Then when we have all 3 loops on our hook, we're going to yarn over and pull through all 3. Let's do this again. Into the next stitch into the front panel, insert only into that front loop. Into the next stitch into the back panel, insert only into that back loop. Then yarn over and pull through everything on our hook. And that's it. We're going to continue doing this until we don't have any more stitches left to work into. When we don't, do a chain up of 1 and cut. So now that our collar is all seamed up, the last thing we're going to do is clean up our armholes. So we're going to make sure that our work is still flipped right side out, right side up. Then we're going to insert our hook into the stitch that we have that's nearest to our side seam. Then we're just going to do a single crochet row, putting 1 single crochet into every side row, then 1 single crochet into every stitch, and we're going to make our way all the way up and over. Slip stitch into that chain space, and then repeat everything we did here on the other side. And then that will be pretty much it. Once we have that finished up, the last thing we're going to have to do is just weave in all of our ends. And there you have it. Hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. Join us on Instagram, Pinterest, or Twitter. Those links are down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Catch you on the next one. Bye!